Good evening to our guests here at the Haifa Center of Law and Technology, and we hope that Professor Lessig is with us as well. Professor Lessig?
I'm still here.
You're still here. Okay, we can see just your screen, I believe, the PowerPoint presentation, the first slide. And we'll be happy. That's you. Hello.
That's me.
Okay. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here at the Haifa Center of Law and Technology, and good morning to our guest across the Atlantic Ocean in San Francisco, Professor Larry Lessig, Lawrence Lessig. I will introduce you, Professor Lessig, shortly, but first would like to say a few things about the project that we are announcing today, launching today, and about our center. The Haifa Center of Law and Technology is very proud, extremely proud, to serve as the Israeli branch of Creative Commons. As Israel today joins 18 other countries to become the 19th country who offers its authors and users the opportunity of using the Creative Commons license. Every now and then at our center we receive phone calls of artists and musicians and other creators. In many cases they have questions. They ask about their rights. What can they do to protect their rights? What can they do against someone whom they suspect used their work without permission? Can they sue? Should they sue? To most of these I listen patiently. It's very interesting and it often provides wonderful material for exam questions. But in most cases I then refer the people who call to attorneys and suggest that they seek professional legal advice. Now, all these authors who call, usually most of them have benign interests. They want to control their works. That is very understandable. A famous Israeli song asks, how is a poem born? And the answer is, like a baby. And all these authors feel that their babies need to be protected. This is natural and understandable. Most of these authors, however, see only part of the picture. They miss the part in which they themselves used works of others to create their new and original in the copyright law term, work. It is probably just natural that one thinks of her creation and disassociates it from previous works. And where there is awareness of this notion of building on previous artists' work, it is often described as homage or inspiration. These authors all assume and operate within what our guest tonight has called in one of his books a permission culture, a culture in which we assume that everything is subject to property and hence to control. A few months ago, I received a phone call from a university employee who is here in the audience. I cannot... Where's Arya? There's Arya. Okay. One of the employees at the university from the computer department, Arya Razi. And Arya is here with us today. Arya stopped by my office and we chatted a bit, and he showed me a website he was constructing, which included his work. Some of his works are paintings based on frames taken from the fashion TV, FTV. Arya told me that he would be delighted if his work are posted online, accessed, distributed, and further used. He was fully aware of his role. It took some material to create a new work of authorship. He realized that he was part of a chain, part of a collaborative project of building and making new works of authorship. But Arya also had some concerns. He was concerned that the credit to him will be omitted. He was concerned that someone would take his work and use it in a commercial setting. So we chatted a bit, and then came Creative Commons. This is where Creative Commons offers its license. It enables Arya to post his works online. It enables him to increase the chances of the work to be accessed, used, distributed, cited, and to serve an inspiration for others. It enables Arya to secure his credit and his wish to prevent commercial use. Creative Commons also allows users to find Arya's work and to use it without fearing that they will receive a cease and desist letter, without a chilling effect. It is this alternative to the permission culture. It is a free culture. Earlier, just before we started, we heard here a song, Olamot Acharim, Other Worlds, I guess, by a musician who is with us today as well, Nimrod Lev. And Nimrod, who is a well-known musician here in Israel, posted his music online, available under a Creative Commons license, and now has become a world known probably through the CC radio. So here we have one more example. Our speaker today made a by now famous distinction between East Coast law and laws, that is laws made by Congress in Washington in the United States and by the courts, and West Coast law, that is code, Silicon Valley. In our small country over here, there is a different, but perhaps not that different, distinction I would like to draw your attention to, and thanks to Neora, one of our guests here tonight, who drew my attention to that as well. Where is Neora? I cannot see over there. South of here, in the city of Herzliya, right now at this very moment, there is a major event called Digital City. It is organized by a tiny, small corporation from the United States, more precisely from Redmond, Washington. And it costs about 20 new Israeli shekels, which is something like $5 to enter that event, and they have lots of noise over there about that conference. That is south of here. Here in Haifa, we offer a free event. That is free both as in free beer as in free speech. I would like to take this opportunity to thank several of the people who helped us launch this event today. Initially and mostly Ohad Maiblum. Ohad is a graduate of our law school and now an attorney in a law firm in New York City. Ohad initiated he came up with the idea that the Haifa Center of Law and Technology serves as the Israeli branch of Creative Commons and made the initial connection. Elad Vider, our coordinator, a devoted coordinator, who's been working so hard over the last couple of months on this project with the wonderful assistance of two of our Martin Edelman fellows, that is Naama Babayev and Ran Majar. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the people of Creative Commons, and especially the people of the iCommons project, Christian Aschenfeld, I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name, as well as the Creative Commons teams both in Canada and in South Africa, both of the teams were extremely helpful in constructing the project over here. Okay, I believe it's time to present and to turn to our guests across the ocean. Lawrence Lessig, Larry Lessig, is professor of law at the Stanford Law School and the founder of the school's Center for Internet and Society. Prior to joining the Stanford faculty, he was the Berkman Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Professor Lessig was also a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin and a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. He clerked for Judge Richard Posner on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and for Justice Antonin Scalia on the United States Supreme Court. His fields of interest and research are constitutional law, contracts, and cyber law. Professor Lessig is the author of numerous articles and of 3 well-known books, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, which was a bestseller, The Future of Ideas, and recently Free Culture. The last book, by the way, can be bought on Amazon.com for something like $10, but it can also be downloaded for free under a Creative Commons license. I'm sure it will be interesting for us to hear how that affected the sales of the book. Professor Lessig is not only a productive and influential scholar, he also practices what he preaches for. He chairs the Creative Commons project. He's a board member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF. He is a board member of the Center for the Public Domain and the commission member of the Penn National Commission on Society, Culture, and Community at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Lessig also practices law here and there. He litigated and argued several prominent cases, including the very famous Eldred v. Ashcroft case in the United States Supreme Court back in 2002. The Wired magazine recently described Professor Lessig as the Elvis of cyber law, but one thing is for sure, you are alive, and we're happy about that. And the television series The West Wing recently had a character based on Professor Lessig. I'm not sure if it was already screened here in Israel, but it will probably happen shortly. So, Professor Lessig, we are delighted to announce today the launch of the Creative Commons in Israel. We had a wonderful exhibition, it still runs outside this hall, in which several Israeli pioneers adopted the Creative Commons license and presented their works of various kinds, whether it's all sorts of creative, wonderful works. The next 45, up to an hour, it's up to you. Minutes are yours, and we'll be delighted to hear your talk. And thereafter, our audience is eager to present some questions. So the floor, the television, or the screen is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and for making it possible for me to be at this event, even though I'm 10,000 miles away. My hope in the next half hour to 45 minutes is to set the context for the Creative Commons project, why it's necessary, and what we hope to accomplish. And set the context first by asking what brought us to this place, not this place in San Francisco or at Haifa, but this place in a debate about how culture gets made and how, more importantly, culture gets shared. So to see this question, I think we have to distinguish between the old world and the new world. And by the old world, I mean the world governed in analog terms, the analog world, which had at its core a set of regulations in terms of copyright law. Now, the point to recognize about copyright law in the old world is that it was tiny. There it is, tiny copyright. And its effect was to regulate both uses and reuses in a small way. So the uses of creative work in the analog world were essentially free of copyright's regulation. And the reuses of creative work in the analog world were essentially free of copyright's regulation. So let me make this a little bit more precise. Think about the uses of a book in the analog world. If we imagine these are all the possible uses of a book, then a certain set of these uses is essentially unregulated. So if you read a book, that's an unregulated act because reading a book produces no copy. Or if you give someone a book, that's an unregulated act because giving someone a book does not produce a copy. Or if you sell a book to someone, that is an unregulated act because explicitly, at least in the American law, selling a book is outside of the reach of copyright. Or if you sleep on a book, that's an unregulated act because sleeping on a book produces no copy. All of these uses of creative work are essentially unregulated by the law. And then at the core of these uses of a creative work are a set of uses which are properly regulated by the law. These uses, for example, publishing a book, require the permission of the copyright owner, and that is a proper restriction in order to create the incentives necessary to produce the creative work in the first place. And then in the American tradition, there's a thin sliver of exceptions that we call fair uses. Uses which otherwise would have been regulated by the law, but which the law leaves free because it's important that these uses remain outside of the control of the copyright owner. So for example, if you take my most recent book, Free Culture, and you write a review of that book and quote sections of the book in your review, even if your review is intended to harm me, or even if it's an idiotic review, and I guarantee you there are plenty of those reviews out there in the marketplace, there's nothing I can do to stop your copying of my work because the law deems your ability to copy my work for these purposes to be more important than my ability to control how my work gets used. So these three possible uses of creative work, unregulated, regulated, and fair uses, defined the analog world. And it's in the balance between these three distinct uses that, for example, libraries got constructed, for the libraries needed no permission to engage in the act of collecting works and making works available. Or, for example, if you tried to put together the works of Robert Frost in a collection to display and facilitate discussion, you would need no permission of the Robert Frost estate in the analog world because all of these uses of Robert Frost's work would be free of the regulation of copyright. So those are the examples of how uses remain free. Now let's think a little bit about how reuses remained free. And to explain this idea, I want to just define a term which should be familiar, the idea of remix in culture. So we understand when creators mix culture together to produce culture. By remix, I mean the act of taking that culture and then consuming it and re-expressing it by citizens. So for example, in this sense, all of culture in some sense is the product of remix. You could say in science, knowledge is the product of remix. You could observe in politics that politics is the product of remix. Remix in this sense is universal, a practice engaged in by humans in every culture since the beginning of human culture. And even corporations engage in this practice of remix. Here's the Apple Corporation saying that they've taken the iPod and remixed it. Politicians engage in remix. This politician took the platform of the Republican Party in the United States, tweaked it in very small ways, and then became a president of the United States as a Democrat, having remixed the Republican platform just slightly. Liberals engage in remix. There's a wonderful site on the web. Daddy, why didn't you or any of your friends from Enron have to go to war? We all engage in this practice of remix. This is how we live. You watch a movie by this man, then you whine to your friends about how it's the best movie ever made or the worst movie you've ever seen. What you're doing is taking Michael Moore's creativity and incorporating it into your life. You're remixing it into your life and sharing it with others. In this sense, every single act of reading or choosing or criticizing or praising culture that you consume is remix, and it's in this way that cultures get made. Now, the important fact to remember about this remix of culture is that, at least in the analog world, this remix is free. Free in the sense of unregulated. You need no permission to engage in these acts of remix. They are free, at least in all the, quote, ordinary ways in which humans access and spread and share culture. These acts of remix are free. You could say they need to be free to avoid infantilizing culture, or you could say they need to be free as a basic human right, regardless of the reason. The point is that these ordinary ways are and ought to be free of the regulation of the law. Now that's the sense of the old world, a world that has regulation of culture balanced by free access and free reuse of culture. And that world needs to be contrasted with what I think of as the new world, or we could call the digital world. And in this world, I want to describe two sorts of changes, one very positive and one potentially very negative. The first positive change is changes in creative potential that have been made possible by digital technologies. And the second negative consequence is changes in the way copyright law regulates these creative processes. So let's start with the creative potential, and here I want to describe just two aspects of the creative potential. The first, and in some ways extremely important potential that the internet brings to culture, is a new commercial creative potential. And the examples here are many. The most obvious, in my view, are examples such as Google, a company that makes an extraordinary amount of wealth on top of other people's content, by taking other people's content and reusing it in a way that extremely amplifies the potential value of that original content. And then the same thing happens with respect to old world businesses as well. So Powell's.com is an extension of one of the largest and most famous used bookstores in the United States, Powell's, which now makes it possible to sell used books in a way that was never possible before the emergence of the network. And then a site called Technorati, which every 5 minutes re-indexes over 10 million weblogs around the world. This creates an opportunity to add value to weblogs that, again, would have been impossible prior to the emergence of these digital technologies. The digital technologies invite the creation of value that otherwise would not have been possible to identify or to exploit. But the changes that I think are potentially more important and certainly less recognized is the increased creative potential, in some sense beyond the commercial marketplace, not quite non-commercial, but not quite commercial in the traditional sense. So think about the way remix culture begins to function in the 21st century. We have a clear sense of what it was in the analog world, where we consume culture, criticize it, share it with our friends. Here's a glimpse of how remix begins to work in the 21st century. And I hope that in the video link that we have, these will be easily transmitted. So, for example, take the context of music. Everybody knows this album by the Beatles called the White Album. That album inspired this album by Jay-Z called the Black Album. And that album then inspired DJ Danger Mouse to create this album called the Gray Album, an album which synthesizes the two tracks of these albums together. Or in the context of film, in 2004, this film Tarnation was displayed at Cannes. It was said by the BBC to wow Cannes. This was a film that was made for $218. It was a film made by a kid who took video that he had shot through his whole life and remixed it together using an iMac that he had been given by his friends, and was able to produce a movie that was of high enough quality to, quote, wow Cannes and to win the Los Angeles International Film Festival Award. Or here's something Charles Schulz never saw.
One, two, three, my baby don't mess around.
Somebody's shaking her head if they see her in the audio.
I know for sure. But does she really wanna? But can't stand to see me walk out the door.
Or think about in the context of politics. Here are some clips from the recent political cycle.
Do you ever get the feeling you're living in a virtual reality dream world, fabricated to enslave your mind?
A live all-war edition of American Juniors.
Shake, shake, shake your body. Shake, shake, shake your body. Push him up, push him up.
But there is another sound, the sound of goodwill.
Oh, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I'm far away in a remote place, and we get these things secondhand.
But this one's a little simpler.
I just know how this world works. I see on the TV screens how hard it is. We're making progress. It is hard work. You know, it's hard work. It's hard work. A lot of really good people working hard. They can do the hard work. That's what distinguishes us from the enemy. And it's hard work, but it's necessary work, and that's essential. But again, I want to tell the American people, it's hard work. It is hard work. It's hard work. There was no doubt in my mind that it's necessary work. I understand how hard it is. That's my job. No doubt about it. It's tough. It's hard work, which I really want to do, but I would hope I'd never have to. Nothing wrong with that. But again, I repeat to my fellow citizens, we're making progress. We're making progress there. I reject this notion. It's ludicrous. It is hard work. It's hard work. That's the plan for victory, and that is the best way. What I said was, it's hard work, and made that very clear.
Or remix is not just for the right, for the left.
Senator John Kerry. Hairstyle by Christoph's, $75. Designer shirts, $250. 42-foot luxury yacht, $1 million. 4 lavish mansions and beachfront estate, over $30 million. Another rich liberal elitist from Massachusetts who claims he's a man of the people. Priceless.
And this is my favorite. This is digital creativity. This is digital remix. And the point to recognize, which I want to insist upon, is that this form of creativity is in all the important respects the same as the form of creativity that we experience in the analog world as analog remix. It's the same activity using different tools. It has a different creative potential. It has a different democratic potential. Changing the freedom to speak by changing the power to speak, making that different. Not just broadcast democracy, but increasingly a bottom-up democracy. Not just the New York Times democracy, but increasingly a blog democracy. Not just the few speaking to the many, but increasingly peer-to-peer. This is the form of creativity that this architecture begs for. And this internet technology makes this kind of creativity possible, as a free digital network enables anyone connected to the network to get access to this creativity that has been produced by anyone with access to a $1,500 computer. Now, this is the good news about the changes to the digital world. Let's think a little bit about the bad news. And this is the consequence of the changes in the way copyright law regulates creative processes. Because these new uses of creative work against the background of old law are technically illegal. And the reason for this illegality ties to a very simple distinction between the analog and digital world. If copyright law is a regulation at its core of something called, quote, copies, then in the digital world, every single use of creative work produces a copy. And thus, in the digital world, every single use presumptively requires the permission of the copyright owner. So that this balance between unregulated uses and regulated uses that defines our life in analog space gets transformed merely by the change in the architectural design of the platform to which we get access to culture. Now, some people say there's a simple solution to this. This man, Stephen Maness, who reviewed my latest book, Free Culture, for Forbes.com, Stephen didn't like my book very much. He said I was a moron, an idiot, and a buffoon, filled with blustering and bloviating prose, he said. But in response to my complaints about the emergence of the, quote, permission culture, Maness said, it's simple. Just get permission to use the creative work which you'd like to use for your creative purpose. But of course, as anybody who lives with creativity in this context knows, the permission to engage in this form of creativity is not only expensive to secure, it's not coming. So, for example, DJ Danger Mouse knew that the Beatles never give permission to reuse their creative work. This kid, after he had made a Cannes-qualified film for $218, then discovered it would cost $400,000 to clear the rights to the music and video clips that he had shot in the background of his video when he was growing up. Or this is my favorite example. Whatever you think about Tony Blair, whatever you think about George Bush, whatever you think about the war, the one thing you can't say about this clip is what the lawyers said when Atmo.se asked for permission to synchronize the music to those images. The lawyer said, no, we will not give you permission because, quote, it's not funny. So the point is, in the world before the analog world, we experienced remix as a practice that was free, at least the ordinary ways in which we accessed and shared our culture were free of the regulation of law. But as we recognize that the ordinary ways are changing, as the technology for experiencing and remaking and re-expressing our culture changes, we have to ask a question. if the ordinary ways in which we experience and access and share our culture changes, do the freedoms to engage in the critical acts of remixing and re-expressing our culture change as well? And the answer is, against the background of the law as it is right now, yes. If the law remains as it is, the freedoms to engage in these forms of creative expression are restricted, which means not that people will not engage in this form of creativity, because of course they will, but that we can't even teach our children how to engage in this form of literacy, because the act of teaching them how to remix two films together would be an act considered to be, quote, piracy. And depending on how, at least in the United States, the Supreme Court decides the Grokster case, you can't promote technologies to facilitate this remixing and re-expressing of culture, because you would be liable for the underlying copyright infringement using those technologies. All we do is punish the act of producing and facilitating this form of creative expression. Now, in my view, what we've seen here is a radical change in regulation of culture. And yet what's surprising is no one has even noticed this change in regulation. And the reason is that we've been distracted. The very same technology that engages this extraordinary act of creative opportunity also facilitates something called piracy. And in response to the problem of, quote, piracy, we in the United States have adopted the strategy we adopt for every single social policy problem. We have waged a, quote, war against these new technologies that facilitate piracy. A war which my friend Jack Valenti refers to as his, quote, own terrorist war, where apparently our children are the terrorists. This rhetoric has produced a kind of extremism around these issues in the United States. We could call it a kind of IP McCarthyism, where if you question the way intellectual property law functions today, if you suggest that perhaps it's gone too far, or perhaps it's out of balance given these changes in technology, then you are referred to, as Bill Gates referred to a bunch of us about 6 months ago, as a, quote, communist, end quote. Now, in my view, we have to find a way to escape this extremism, because the extremism is and will be extraordinarily destructive to the potential of this technology to both expand the way culture gets produced and distributed and change, in some ways, the way culture gets made. And the way to escape this extremism is to do something which is quite familiar to those of us in California, to plead for peace in this debate. And I want to suggest 3 ways in which we might begin to facilitate peace in this debate. The first is for people like me to more consistently and more loudly express our view that we're against something called, quote, piracy. This debate is not about whether you have access to music for free or not. If I thought the question in this debate was whether you should have access to Britney Spears for free, for example, I'd be on the other side of the debate, because I'm not sure you should have access to Britney Spears at any price. Instead, this debate is about free access to culture for purposes that have traditionally been the purposes that people have had free access to culture, to begin to spread and change that culture. It's not to get access in ways that undermine the position and opportunity of artists to make money. So first, we should express we're against piracy. But second, we should push for reform in legal regulations of culture that were designed for centuries long gone, that no longer make sense of these technologies in light of the opportunities that they create for the widest range of creators. But again, the reality in the United States, at least, is that there's no opportunity for legal reform, because both political parties are captured by the extremism around this IP McCarthy-like debate. And so rather than depending upon legal reform now, it's much more important that we focus on ways to facilitate private reform in this space first. Now, private reform begins by recognizing that in some sense, most of the problem here is created by the change in the default of copyright's regulation. The way copyright functions in the digital world is to grant more control through law than authors actually need or, in fact, in many cases, want. And so what private reform needs to do is find ways to change this default so that a wider range of culture is accessible in ways consistent to the underlying wishes of the artist. And that's the objective of Creative Commons. We seek a simple way to enable artists and authors to mark their content with the freedoms that they intend their content to carry. So if you go to our website and you click on the publishing options, you're given the choice to choose a license. The license asks a couple simple questions. Do you want to enable commercial use of your work? Do you want to allow modifications of your work? And if you allow modifications of your work, do you want to require that others release their modifications of your work under similarly free terms, what's discussed as the copyleft component of our licenses? Once you make these choices, you're given a license. The license comes in 3 separate layers. The first is a human-readable commons deed that expresses the freedoms associated with this content in terms that anyone can understand. The second, and very different, is a lawyer-readable license, a billion-page document written by some of the best lawyers in first Silicon Valley and now increasingly around the world that makes enforceable the freedoms associated with your content. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a machine-readable expression of the freedoms associated with your content, making it possible for search engines to begin to gather content on the basis of the freedoms. Now, these 3 layers are crucial in being linked together. It's important that we make the freedoms associated with content understandable, unchallengeable, and usable in the digital age. Now, the most important development in this project after our initial launch has been the adoption of the iCommons project to assure that the legal code related to our licenses gets ported to as many jurisdictions around the world as possible. Right now there are over 70 jurisdictions in the world in the process of porting these licenses, and this map begins to describe where we have had some effect. The green areas are in some sense liberated with Creative Commons licenses. The yellow areas are areas that will in the next 6 months be releasing Creative Commons licenses. And of course, we're here today to celebrate this tiny little extremely important bit of green in the middle of a lot of ocean of red, the launch of the Creative Commons licenses in Israel. So our objective here is to find a way to develop code, both legal and technical, that will facilitate the spread and adoption of what we think of here as free culture. Now, in the first year of Creative Commons existence, we recorded more than 1 million linkbacks to our licenses on the web. 18 months later, that number was about 1.9 million linkbacks to our licenses. 24 months into the project, it was just over 4 million linkbacks to our licenses. After 30 months in the project, the number is now over 14 million linkbacks to licenses in our project, as the iCommons project has spread these licenses internationally. And if you look at the 14 million linkbacks to our licenses, you begin to get a very interesting snapshot picture of how people ordinarily think about making their work available on the web. This is a chart which is much too complicated to discern at such a distance, but let me just simplify what it says. It says that 2/3 of people adopting Creative Commons licenses insist on a non-commercial use of their creative work. 2/3 permit people to make derivative uses of their work. And about half of those who facilitate the right to derivative uses of their work also require that people release their work under similarly free terms, adopting the copyleft idea that we have built into our licenses. So that's the idea. Here's how it actually functions. So this is a song written by a guitarist named Colin Mutchler called My Life. It was donated to an online sound resource called OpSound. OpSound made it available under a Creative Commons license for other people to download and to remix. A little bit after it was first released, a 17-year-old violinist named Cora Beth downloaded the song and added the violin track that you hear on top. And she then released that song back to the net, renaming the song My Life Changed. And since the release, there's been at least 7 other remixes of this song, some of them fantastic, some of them a little bit embarrassing. There's a Japanese remix called My Life Changed Absolutely, which we don't advertise that much. But the point is, this practice of creativity between two people who had never met each other, who never spoke to each other, who never engaged in any clearance of any rights, was possible legally without a lawyer standing between these two creators, because the freedom to engage in this kind of creativity was already built into the technology that they used to access and remake their creative work. Now, many people say to us, especially thinking about artists, why would you ever use such a tool to give away rights that the law gives you by default? And we point to examples to get people to begin to see the reason why this might make sense. And one of the most important examples actually has nothing to do with Creative Commons, but demonstrates the point, I think, very clearly. There's a very important band in the United States called Wilco, which when they were releasing the album before the most recent they released, an album called Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, was told by their record label that the record label didn't like the recording, and they wanted them to re-record the Yankee Hotel Foxtrot recording. Well, Wilco believed that the recording was excellent as it was, and they didn't want to re-record it. So Reprise Records told Wilco that they would not release the record, and so Wilco said, fine, give us back the record, and we'll release it ourselves. So Reprise gave them the recording, and Wilco then released it on the net in a way that basically said you were free to share this in a non-commercial way. And that release on the web resulted in an extraordinary spread of the content of Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. And that spread created such a buzz that another record label, in fact a record label owned by the same company as Reprise Records was owned by, bought back the rights to Yankee Hotel Foxtrot for 3 times the price that they had originally sold the record to Reprise Records. And they released the record now as a CD. And the CD sales for this record were far greater than any CD sales that this band, Wilco, had ever seen before. So the message is they released the content in a free way, and the product of that release was increased sales of their underlying CDs. Or here's another example, more familiar to me. My most recent book, Free Culture, was released both published in the traditional form in bookstores and released free on the web under a Creative Commons license. The idea to do this was actually my publishers, because the publisher recognized that there are really only 2 numbers that you need to worry about in deciding whether it makes sense to make creative work available for free. The first number we could call the cannibalization rate, the number of people who won't buy the book because it's now available for free. And that number needs to be contrasted with what you could call the penetration boost, the number who will now buy the book because they've seen the book and never would have seen the book before, and because they're an ordinary human and don't like to read books on a computer, would now decide they'll buy the book because they're interested in the content of the book. And the point that the publisher recognized is that if the second number is greater than the first, if the number who will buy the book because they've gotten access to it is greater than the number who will choose not to buy the book because they can get it for free, then it makes more sense. You sell more books by making the books available for free in an electronic form. Or here's a third example. One of the sites that we've established using our licenses and our technology is something called CC Mixter. CC Mixter allows musicians to put songs into a pool that then are marked with which songs were remixed to produce that particular song, and then tracks, which songs remix that particular song. This is the page in Mixter for one of our artists, a guy named Minus Kelvin. Minus Kelvin is a physics teacher in an American high school. That's how he got the name Minus Kelvin. He plays in a band in his off hours, but his main source of income is teaching kids physics. As you see on his website, when he marked what is he looking for, he said he's looking for a record label. And so he put a bunch of content up there beginning in February of this year. And this content is a particular flavor of remix that is his own particular style. Well, 3 weeks ago, Runoff Records signed Minus Kelvin to a record label contract, and Runoff Records had discovered Minus Kelvin in CC Mixter. So here Minus Kelvin had made his creative work available in a context which made uses, at least some uses, free, and out of that got a record label that he certainly never would have gotten in his life as a physics teacher. Or finally, outside of the context of arts, let's think about the way science might interact with this movement. We've started something called the Science Commons, which is a sister project focused on the particular issues related to access to data and inventions and published works in the context of science. Scientists live under a different ethic from the ethic governing musicians. It's not just their objective to produce knowledge, but the ethic of a scientist is to produce universal access to knowledge. Access which is guaranteed to anybody internationally, regardless of whether they're fortunate enough to be at a rich university or not. So the universal access to knowledge commitment has started an open access publishing movement. So the Public Library of Science is a particularly important example of this. They have refereed journals that publish both in physical terms and also electronically, and all of their electronic work is available under Creative Commons licenses for free forever internationally. And we've just launched an open access law project in the United States, which has gathered 22 law journals in the United States that also commit to making legal material available for free forever to anyone internationally. Now, in all of these cases, what the creators or copyright owners are recognizing is that there's a big gap between the world of all rights reserved and no rights respected. And that gap is the gap that we at Creative Commons are trying to fill. Simple tools to express what we believe most people believe should be the rules governing their creative work, that some of the rights that the law gives them they need to reserve, and you need to negotiate with them in order to secure those rights, but that other rights can be given away in a way that actually in many contexts benefits the creator. So we want a simple way to say that these rights have been offered to others, so that we also have a simple way to show the world that the world of creators is not divided between the all rights reserved extremists of Hollywood or the no rights respected extremists that people associate with the internet, but instead that the world is mainly composed by these people who have a more balanced conception of the freedoms and restrictions that copyright law ought to provide. Now let me put this together in the end here with a little bit of a framing to this debate. 1995, when the World Wide Web really began to take off, the norms of the internet could be expressed in this drawing. Regulation, according to the norms, were the exception, and the default was freedom. People could do with content whatever they wanted. There were certain things people understood they shouldn't do, but in the main, the assumption was the use of content on the web would be free. By 2005, in the United States at least, the law has transformed that into the opposite view, where freedom now is the exception. And the default, according to the law in the United States at least, is that regulation is the norm. The objective of Creative Commons is to find a simple way to reclaim some of the freedom from the earlier days of the net, or to restore some of the freedom from the earlier days of the net, so that we can move from this picture back to a picture closer to this. Not by taking the rights of anyone, but by encouraging creators and authors and copyright holders in general to mark their work in a way that signals the freedom that they believe the net ought to produce, the freedom that in a digital age is essential to the opportunities of the digital technologies to be used in ways which they most effectively are designed to be used. Now, this project has so far had an extraordinary spread and success. And this picture, which I just put together last night, I think captures it in a way that is extraordinarily surprising even to me. And when I present this idea to many and they begin to recognize how quickly this project has spread, they ask me a question which I'm increasingly embarrassed to be asked. And the question is, how do you like being the father of this movement? And in fact, the idea of fatherhood has been quite close to my heart very recently. I am also the father of a 20-month-old son. But the 20-month-old son rarely sees me because in the last year and a half I've been in a hotel room about 150 days out of the year and a half. I've flown over 300,000 miles. And so most of my experience with my son comes through a video camera that I connect to my computer, and it looks something like this. So this is my relationship with my son. And in this process of watching both Creative Commons and my son grow up, I've increasingly recognized a very important fact about what fatherhood is. Fatherhood is this experience which has a very small, very fun part at the start. And then the reality is that the work is typically done by other people elsewhere. And that's also true with the way Creative Commons has worked. We had extraordinary fun at the start of this project about 4 years ago, launching an idea to use the law to clear away some of the burdens that the law has imposed on the creative opportunities of the net. But the real work in this project has been done by the extraordinary range of people in over 70 countries around the world, exploding this project in a way that becomes extremely successful. So I'm very happy to be here today to welcome you to the free world. But most importantly, I'm here to thank you. And I want to thank you in two distinct ways. First, for your work to make this project possible in Israel and to make it successful in this part of the world. But especially and personally, I want to thank you for allowing me to welcome you to the free world and then permitting me to leave this meeting and go back and spend some more time with my boy. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have about our project or where we intend to take it from now. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that wonderful talk lecture. That was fascinating, and your son is very cute indeed, so we like that as well, and all the videos in between. And our audience here has a lot of questions about the project, I'm sure, and about some upcoming events such as the Gokster decision. We'd like to hear your take about that, I guess. Questions, please. Yeah, just a second.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Klinga. I just wanted to ask about the enforcement of Creative Commons. How can you enforce your rights, first of all, and how can you practice them outside? Meaning, how can you lobby yourself politically to engage in such rights and to have the legal acceptance?
Yeah. So in some sense, we benefit from exactly the problem that I've described copyright law creating. So I've said copyright law is extreme in its enforcement and reach, but it's because of the extremism of copyright law that the Creative Commons project is feasible. So we enforce Creative Commons licenses the way any other copyright gets enforced. If you use creative work, then the question is, what permission do you have to use it? If the creative work is marked with a Creative Commons license, that functions as the permission. So if the copyright owner tried to sue you for downloading his work that's marked by a Creative Commons license, we believe any court in the world would look at the license and say, what are you talking about? The license expressly says that he has these freedoms, so that the ability to enforce the copyright is restricted by the freedoms that are marked in the license. But on the other hand, the freedoms that are not given away in the license, for example, if a license restricts commercial use, are still with the copyright owner, and the copyright owner gets to enforce them exactly as the copyright owner wants. Now, the reality is the only important context in which people would want to be enforcing their rights, or typically get to enforce their rights outside of moral rights contexts, which are themselves very important, is in the context of commercial use. And so again, if you focus on the fact that 2/3 of the users of our licenses have reserved commercial rights to themselves while giving away non-commercial rights, what that means is that 2/3 of these users essentially recognize that they're letting people use it in the ordinary way without any expectation of enforcing the copyright against them. But if a record label picks up a song and starts producing a record on the basis of it, then that would be a commercial use that would be defended or enforced in the traditional way that copyright law would enforce any violation of a copyright. Now, what's very important about this is that the second part of your question, we don't have to lobby politicians or lawmakers at all in this process. In our view, the rights protected by the copyright and the license that Creative Commons makes possible are all possible given existing law exactly as it is. All that we're trying to do is to make it simpler for existing law to function in the way that copyright law has always intended that it function, to facilitate a really subtle and multiple way in which creative work can be protected using the many different rights that copyright law grants.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shlomi Fish. I would like to ask how the attribution clause, not the attribution part of the Creative Commons license, how it relates to the attribution one that was found in the original BSD licenses.
Well, so the attribution clause, which basically initially required that you give attribution to the author, and just this week we have versioned the clause to say that you can require attribution either to the original author or to some collective, for example, like a Wikipedia could be the collective that requires attribution, or to both, was inspired by the idea behind the BSD clause, because what the BSD license and many of the original what's now called open source licenses, but they were effectively free licenses, free software licenses did, was recognize that the one thing that's very important to authors is that they gain credit for their creative work. That's the essential part. But that the control of the distribution of their creative work is not something that's important to those authors. So we took inspiration from the BSD, and more generally, I've been very open about this in many contexts, we stole the ideas of the free software movement and have extended them to culture. Now, they extend differently. It's not exactly the same set of freedoms that the free software movement insists upon, but it's the same idea that you use copyright law to carve out a set of freedom according to the wishes of the creators. So just as software creators require attribution, we give an attribution license that permits people to get attribution, but give away the other rights that they don't think that they need to control.
My name is Susan Lazinger, and I'm a non-lawyer. My question is, if the Creative Commons license is a global international thing, why does it matter where the person lives and whether his or her country has accepted this? In other words, it looks to me as though anyone could decide to do this from any country.
A great question. And technically, that's true. Technically, the license that we set up as the generic license follows the form of a license that the World Intellectual Property Association has established to facilitate anybody anywhere adopting the license in a way that should be enforceable anywhere. But what we've found is that there are two reasons to facilitate local adoption of licenses. One reason is technical and legal, that in fact, despite the belief that there's a universal standard that will be applied anywhere, there are important differences in countries around the world. And so we wanted to give particular people in particular countries the option, at least, of adopting a license that's naturally suited to the law within their own country. So, for example, the fair dealing provisions that might exist in the British context don't exist in the American context. We call that fair use. And so the attempt to make clear that those are not being modified requires some specification at the local level. But frankly, the second reason is to me the more important reason. That's really about making sure people recognize that what Creative Commons is doing is not an American idea. What Creative Commons is doing is to facilitate people anywhere around the world to engage in this act of expressing freedoms associated with their content in a way that's very particular to their own legal jurisdiction. So the Creative Commons project that began in the United States is slowly morphing to this international organization that's located in London, something called Creative Commons International. That organization will now work with CC Israel to help CC Israel in steps after the porting of the license. But that organization is really keyed on recognizing that this is not particular to America. This is a universal movement made up of different connections in different parts of the world. So it's both for technical legal reasons, but much more importantly for the political purpose of making people take ownership for this project that we've begun to launch these licenses locally.
Hello, I'm Stefano. Okay, this question, Creative Commons doesn't seem to be only a license, but a social movement. From an economic perspective, free market failed to provide a public good because nobody is willing to invest in something if everybody can free ride for this investment. From this perspective, Creative Commons is quite paradoxical because authors who decide to put their works under Creative Commons explicitly invite people to free ride on this investment. So how do you think you can reconcile this economical argumentation with the Creative Commons attempt to create a social cooperative behavior?
Yeah, so I spent many years working as an economist. In fact, 20 years ago, I was a research assistant for an economist at Tel Aviv University. So I'm very familiar with the particular genius and particular blindness of economics. So let's start with the genius. It's certainly true that for certain economies, the free riding problem is a significant problem, and you won't get significant investment in certain creative works unless you can control the distribution of that work in a way that returns value to the original creator. But the obvious point to recognize is that all forms of creativity don't depend upon that control of the exclusive right. So again, think about Google. Google produces extraordinary value in part because there's no exclusive right blocking their access to the underlying creative work that they are using to build their indexes and build ways to give people access to that creative work. And more importantly, what Google demonstrates is something which economists have begun to describe as not the problem of rivalrous resources, but what Stephen Weber at Berkeley calls the anti-rival nature of certain resources. So, for example, think about the resource called the English language. This is a resource which there is no tragedy of the commons when more people speak the English language. In fact, there's the opposite, a comedy of the commons when more people speak the English language. When more people speak the English language, the language becomes more valuable to everybody. So we who speak English as our mother tongue don't get upset when people from other countries speak our language. It's not as if we say, oh, you're a bunch of free riders off of the English language. Instead, quite the contrary. We're very happy when you speak the English language because that makes it possible for ignorant Americans like me to talk to people around the world without having to learn their language, right? So there's a positive value that's associated to this, quote, free riding. And I think what we're seeing in the context of many creative industries is that too serious a focus on the narrow model of rivalrous resources that economists talk about lead people to miss the extraordinary gain in value that's produced when resources are more universally accessible. And so in my view, there's a balance to be struck. And all we're doing at Creative Commons is providing a set of tools that enable people to experiment, to decide the balance. Now, in the context of culture, I don't go around telling people that they ought to put their music out for free or that they ought to make their book available for free. I go around telling people that my job is to make legal tools that you can use, and you should experiment. You should just recognize that nobody knows what the right balance here is, and you should experiment to see what works best. And what Wilco discovered is that freer access increased the demand for their product, contrary to what the narrow economics model might suggest. In the context of science, though, I do take a very strong normative position. I don't believe it's just the case that scientists ought to experiment here. I think scientists have an ethical obligation to try to make their work available in a way that's universally accessible. And that's, again, because we typically fund science, or we ought to fund science, in a way that's unrelated to the exclusive rights market that typically governs in the context of, for example, CDs. So the bottom line here is economics is true with respect to some areas of human life, but we all recognize that it's false with respect to other areas of human life, and that if we imagined our life governed by the market in every single sphere, we'd have a very different human life. And the most obvious example of this is that I take it you value amateur non-market sex more than you value professional market-based sex, and so ought you to value those particular forms of human interaction. So that's a general point to answer your very specific question.
Hi, my name is Guy West, and I wanted, in O'Reilly's conference in OSCON 2002, you were very pessimistic to free culture. Are there any threats to Creative Commons, and what are those threats?
Yeah, so 2002 was before my son was born, so I was very pessimistic, and now my general view is optimism about everything. Are there threats? There are threats. The threats come from lawyers primarily. So there's an organization called the International Association of Entertainment Lawyers, whose one of its founders, Michael Sukin, has launched what he calls a, quote, lobbying campaign against Creative Commons. He was quoted in an article in Billboard as saying that Creative Commons was a, quote, serious threat to the entertainment industry in the United States. It was a, quote, virus that was spreading in the creative communities, and that it would destroy the income of the United States and the copyright markets. Now, the important thing to focus on there is that the International Entertainment Lawyers Association is a bunch of lawyers whose work we are really trying to eliminate. Right? What we're trying to do is to remove lawyers from the creative process, at least in a certain segment of creativity where they don't do any good. Now, of course, I produce lawyers for a living, so I don't want to eliminate lawyers totally. But my view is that they ought to be allocated to the places where they actually do some value or some good, and the idea that they should be in the middle of all forms of creativity using digital technology seems to me to be a mistake. So that's the place that concerns me the most, that lawyers will create all sorts of fear, uncertainty, and distrust around what we're trying to do that will scare people away from it. I've been very encouraged, on the other hand, by some of the artists' associations, or even industry associations. The Recording Industry Association of America and the Motion Picture Association of America, both of their presidents at the time that we launched, Jack Valenti and Hillary Rosen, endorsed Creative Commons. Kerry Sherman, the current president of the RIAA, continues to endorse and support Creative Commons because at least he recognizes that all we're trying to do is give artists a choice about how to respect their underlying rights. So I think as long as we can emphasize that what the Creative Commons movement is trying to do is just to lower the cost of the law in the context of artists expressing their choice, and distinguish that from the work that some of us are trying to do in legal reform, I think that we avoid the great risk. And quite frankly, one of the problems we face is that people associate Creative Commons too much with my own work, because the fact is that I have a set of views about copyright law that are not really the views of Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a much more boring, middle-of-the-road organization than I think my own views are. And I think it's important to emphasize the distinction if we're going to at least avoid some of the unnecessary criticism and opposition that I think has begun to develop. But so far, I've been extraordinarily surprised with the adoption and embrace of this by a wide range of organizations.
Hi, my name is Neora. I produced some papers, some documents with a Creative Commons logo, and somebody came up to me and asked me, do you have permission to print this logo? And I said, yes, like I didn't really know what to reply. And then he said, let me ask you a better question. Could you print your documents about Creative Commons with a different logo, like write the CC in a different way than they do? But
yeah, no, so we're going to be suing you right now, and the lawyer will be coming to find you very soon. No, we explicitly give people the permission to use our logo, which is protected by trademark law, for the purpose of associating with our underlying licenses. But the question reveals an important, I mean, not your question, but the question you were asked, reveals a very important simplification that I think people bring to this debate. Absolutely, we believe that copyright law and trademark law serve important functions in the economy, and we are not against either. And if somebody were to use our trademark in a way that was inconsistent with the proper identification to our licenses, for example, if they wrote their own licenses and then called them Creative Commons license and used our logo, we would have a legitimate and I think justified trademark complaint against them. On the other hand, we've given our licenses away under a Creative Commons license. You're allowed to take the licenses as long as you give us credit and use them for whatever purpose you want. So you can create a different logo, a different organization that uses our licenses as long as somewhere in them you say these licenses are from the Creative Commons. So we've given as much freedom as we can, but we've tried to retain the ability to control the connection between our message and our particular tools that we're using so that people can't break that connection. And I think that traditionally has been the important, useful role for trademark law. Trademark law has recently become much broader than that. In South Africa, just 2 weeks ago, there was a very important decision by the South African Constitutional Court limiting the scope of trademark law. In that case, a bunch of kids had taken some famous trademarks and remixed them in a way to make a political point. In this particular case, they'd made a T-shirt of a very famous South African beer called Black Label, and they'd remixed it to say Black Label, White Guilt. And the beer company had sued them for trademark infringement, and they had won in 3 separate courts in South Africa. But the Constitutional Court said that the function of trademark law is not to block these free speech uses of the trademarks, it's to assure that there's some connection between the actual product and the trademark itself. So it restricted trademark, I think, to its proper domain, which is to make sure that there isn't confusion in consumers about who made a certain product. But confusion is different from criticizing. So you're free to use our trademarks to criticize us, to ridicule us. Absolutely. Go ahead. The more press we get like that, the better for us.
Hi, my name is Tal Zarsky. I really enjoyed your presentation, but I thought there might have been a missing link, which I want to ask you about. You start out talking about the way we have to mix and burn so to remix and create a better society, and that we all talk about and throw back at our friends the content that is protected by copyright and thus facilitating the discourse. And in a response to a certain degree is Creative Commons. What I wanted to ask is whether you see under the Creative Commons these forms of content that underlie the discourse you're talking about. these kinds of content, like the words McDonald's, the shows we see on Fox, Outcast that you showed us, these forms of content which are formed in a market that have great barriers to entry, that, as you write elsewhere, require price discrimination to capitalize on vast funds needed to create them. So do you really see tomorrow's Outcast, tomorrow's Fox, coming out on a Creative Commons license? And if not...
Okay. So just summarizing, Creative Commons is a first step. It builds an awareness or a recognition. And our view is that if it becomes a successful first step, that will begin to change the political discussion. Now, whether we'll ever get to where I think we ought to get with respect to, Viacom culture or Fox culture, I don't know. But I am convinced that we won't get there unless a wide range of citizens participate in building a different vision of what intellectual property should be. And that's what Creative Commons is trying to do.
Thank you very much. I believe that the cutoffs we had indicate that we should probably wrap up soon. So just a couple of questions, please, on my behalf. First, you mentioned that currently there are over 14 million works under Creative Commons license. However, I was wondering about the quality of those works. And usually it's very difficult, if not impossible, to define quality. And what the economists usually tell us, as I discussed today with Stefano, who asked you a question earlier, usually economists say that, well, we have no idea what quality is, but the market knows. The market defines. That's where demand meets supply. That's the quality. That's the price, and the price indicates the quality of the work. However, in the market of works protected under Creative Commons, whether we can call it a market at all, there is no price indication. So how do you figure out whether those 14 million works are worth anything? Obviously, you gave us some wonderful examples of works which succeeded, and the Wilco case and some other, with the Wilco example, and some other wonderful examples. But are those just few examples, and the other 13.9 thousand works are useless? Is that the case?
Yeah, as a lawyer, I know little about quality. I know little about artistic merit. I confess that I'm a total fan of terrible Hollywood movies, so I'm not going to tell you anything about what's good and what's bad here. I will resist a bit the notion that economics believes that it is the only that the price mechanism is the only mechanism for signaling quality. That, of course, is not even economics' claim. It's one mechanism for signaling quality, but we all understand that there are all sorts of other economies of creative work that demonstrate their quality in other ways. For example, just the demand that there is to consume bits of quality. So when during the election cycle you had video clips that were being distributed on the web, one of the most famous was a parody of This Land Is My Land with John Kerry and George Bush. There was a huge number of people who downloaded and consumed that. That was a pretty good signal of the quality, even though the price of getting access to it was zero. Now, in my view, what's important here is not so much building a system of quality as building a system of freedom. Right? So I view this as a lawyer or as a constitutional lawyer by asking, what right does someone have to block this kind of creativity? Not, is the form of creativity the kind that the Committee on Creativity and the Central Politburo of the state would approve of, right? So it might be that that's terrible creativity. I don't know. But what's important to me is that we encourage a wide range of people to participate in this kind of creativity. You could link this a little bit to think about photography. Think about all the crap that gets photographed and produced. Used to be you would actually have to use chemicals and trees to be able to print it, but now you can just use digital images to do it. You can believe in the value of this industry of photography without believing that it's going to produce 10 million Robert Kappas out there. On the other hand, we do know that the value of this industry does eventually help produce more Robert Kappas. And in my view, what this industry of digital media creates is not so much the next George Lucas or the next Alfred Hitchcock. What this form of creativity creates is a more self-conscious, critical understanding of what this culture is and how it gets made. So there's a similar debate that happens in the context of blogs. People say blogs are just filled with schlock. Most of them are crap. Like, why would you ever pay any attention to what happens in blogs? And again, I don't know what percentage is good and what percentage is bad. But I do know that there's something extremely valuable in imagining at least 10 million people out there who are sitting down and writing in forms that other people can criticize their views. Because the very practice of writing in this way actually, I think, changes how people think about certain ideas and actually makes them much more mature and critical about what, in fact, they are writing. And in my view, that's a similar story that would happen to culture if we were to open this culture up. So, good for Hollywood if Hollywood turns out to be the only great producer of culture in the future, even if you open this method up. But I actually have more faith that the wider, freer market of creativity will produce extraordinary creativity. At least that's the hope.
Well, thank you. And one last question. You mentioned Hollywood, and the United States Supreme Court is supposed to hand out a decision in the Goxa case any day. Well, if you wish to make a prediction, we'd love that. But in any case, whatever the decision would be, will it matter? Or will not code overcome the law in that case?
Yeah, so the great thing about the way the case was understood and argued in the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court recognized the issue was not whether piracy should be permitted or not. The issue was instead whether judges or courts should be in the position of deciding which technologies should be allowed or not. So in some sense, it's a very narrow question of jurisdiction. Should courts be in the business of deciding which technologies will be allowed? And if the court focuses on that question, I think the court gets the right answer, which is that these are judgments for Congress to make, not for the court to make. Now, if the court gets it wrong, and bans peer-to-peer technology, will it matter? Absolutely it will matter. It won't matter to the number of people who are pirating works. I don't think that will change, quote, piracy at all. But what it will change is the industry or innovation that gets developed around these technologies. So the most important thing that peer-to-peer technologies could do is not facilitate piracy, but to lower the cost of distributing content dramatically. Because the cost of distributing content with peer-to-peer technology gets shared among the people who consume the content, and the cost of distributing content in the traditional way is all borne by the original speaker. There are many businesses that could begin to develop business models around this technology who will be chilled if the Supreme Court decides this case wrongly. So from the perspective of pirates, I don't think the case will matter at all. From the perspective of business and the integration of these technologies into the mainstream of the internet, it will matter dramatically. And it's that cost that I think we need to focus on, and not so much the changing the behavior of the, quote, pirates out there.
Well, thank you very much. I believe it's time for us to wrap up. So first of all, I would like to thank you for devoting so much time and effort and joining us this morning from San Francisco. So please join me once again.
Thank you.